Today's passage comes from Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 through 4 and 8 through 11. Hear the word of the Lord. The breath of Lord Yahweh is upon me, because Yahweh has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor and the day of revenge of our God, in comfort to all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a failing breath. They will be called the oaks of righteousness, the planting of Yahweh, to display his glory. They shall bind up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. For I, Yahweh, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. I will faithfully give them their recompense, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them. Their descendants shall be known among the nations, and their offspring among the peoples. All who see them shall acknowledge that they are a people whom Yahweh has blessed. I will greatly rejoice in Yahweh. My whole being shall exult in my God. For he has clothed me with the garments of restoration. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself in a garland, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. For as the earth brings forth its shoots, and as a garden causes what is sown in it to spring up, so Lord Yahweh will cause righteousness and praise to spring up before all the nations. The word of God to the people of God. Thanks be to God. You know, it's not what we think. It's not what we were told it was. It's not what people long ago understood and passed down to us. Yahweh's working definition of blessing seems to have fallen upon deaf ears at least since the time of the Babylonian exile of Judah. We don't really want to hear how Yahweh defines blessing, what to expect at the coming of Messiah. And yet, if we are seeking to encounter the Messianic blessing foretold to us, it would seem we should go back to discerning what it was that Yahweh had specified, that we might understand and embrace the blessing so promised. When Jesus began his public ministry, accepting the mantle cast upon him, these words from Isaiah were words that he chose to identify himself with the promised blessing of Yahweh. They were words that did not speak to the common understandings of what the Messianic reign would look like. They did not address the common definitions of blessing. The people in Jesus' day wanted freedom from their Roman oppressors. They wanted blessing to look like peace. On the other hand, to look like the overthrow of an oppressive regime. They wanted it to look like an exchange of their overlords for people who were of their own kin. They wanted all sorts of things that had very little to do with Yahweh's promise of blessing. And so Jesus begins accepting the mantle and the category of being Messiah thrown upon his shoulders by citing these words from Isaiah. He spoke of restoring and patching up those who were brokenhearted, who were injured, maimed, sick, stepped on and trod upon by society, those whose lives were in jeopardy, in peril, those considered not simply vulnerable, but of no worth to the larger society. That in them and through them, the righteousness or the justice of Yahweh might shine through. Our translations often try to make some sort of distinction between these terms, justice and righteousness. Yet in the Hebrew, they are one and the same. It is one term that speaks of doing what is right and calls that justice. It is the same term that speaks of being just and defines it as doing the right things on behalf of those around us, despite custom or the demands of some law or the requirements of culture and heritage and tradition. To be just, to be righteous, was to look out for the needs of the fallen, the vulnerable, those neglected and stepped upon, and raise them up to be on par with all others. When Yahweh speaks through Isaiah here of transforming these neglected people within the nation of Judah and transforming them into oaks of righteousness, he is speaking of their coming to be the ones in whom Yahweh's will and purpose are made visible, come to bear fruit, enter into the majority slice of Judah's society. Yahweh says, I hate evil and wrongdoing and theft. But as we look to the Mosaic Code and how it talked about Yahweh's blessings being for all the people, we must remind ourselves that bringing the tithes and offerings into the tabernacle or the temple was more than simply an expression of worship. It was more than simply making sure that the priestly class had access to the bounty of the land. The fruits of the land were to be provided with equity for all members of the society. I grew up with these notions of a, quote, Protestant work ethic, end quote. And what that meant for me growing up was that my worth and value were tied to my productivity. They were tied to how hard I worked. They were tied to the effort that I put into the tasks ahead of me. I was taught that if I worked hard, the results of my labor would be everything I could dream of. At the same time, I was taught that brain labor could be more valuable than manual labor. And then on top of that was another category whereby the investment of wealth and resources could be deemed of greater worth and value than the labor used to multiply those resources. I was also taught that wealth prosperity was the end goal of ambition. To make something of oneself was to rise above the common man around us. Those who invested their time and energy in manual labor or even in brain labor. Those who no longer needed to work because they had arisen to a higher echelon, a higher level in society. And then I was also taught that wealth corrupts. And you see, none of those conflicting teachings that I received as a child growing up form any of the basis here for Yahweh's blessing. The Messianic blessing coming from Yahweh is not rooted in labor. It is not rooted in effort. It is not rooted in wealth. It is not rooted in brain power, in productivity, or in capacity to make something out of ourselves. Rather, the Messianic blessing depicted here in Isaiah 61 is Yahweh's version of righteousness and justice, wherein the needs of one and all are met with no consideration for the different ways that societies around the world have given different levels of value to some people over others. There's nothing in Yahweh's blessing tied to labor, industry, productivity, brain power, or the accumulation of wealth. There's nothing in this depiction of Yahweh's blessing through Messiah that has anything to do with political power or the overthrow of enemies. Rather, Jesus finds the expression here of Yahweh's righteousness and justice, couched in a depiction of mercy, compassion, of the justice required in meeting the needs of one and all, despite society's definitions of personal worth and value. Now, the definition here is that blessing comes as we engage our lives in the practice of Yahweh's understanding of righteousness and justice, where the needs of one and all are fully met out of the bounty with which Yahweh has blessed us as a nation, society, civilization, as people living on this planet of Yahweh's creation. The depiction here is of a world of bounty, a world of abundance created so by Yahweh to meet the needs of one and all without distinction, without discrimination. This last week, our Jewish friends began celebrating Hanukkah, a festival of lights, a minor festival in the Jewish calendar, hearkening back to an event in which there was only seemingly enough oil to light the lamps in the temple for one night. And yet, for a period of 8 days those lamps remained lit until the oil could be refreshed. In the economy of Yahweh, there are ample resources to meet the needs around us beyond our understandings, beyond our imaginings, beyond the rules that we would use to say what is enough. In one of the Sunday school rooms here, there's a quote still on the dry whiteboard after 10 months of pandemic. Those who gathered much had just enough. Those who gathered little did not go without. In Yahweh's economy, there are ample resources to provide for the needs of everyone. And yet, our perceptions are that we must hoard, that we must devalue some people as not being as worthy as ourselves to enjoy the blessings of Yahweh's provision. While we deal in categories of scarcity and lack, Yahweh's righteousness and justice is built on a category of abundance. The blessings of the Messianic reign of God come when we avail ourselves of God's command, of God's requirement, that we employ the resources at our disposal to meet the needs of all. That is blessing. That is freedom. That is the life in which we can relinquish the constant dread of not having enough, the burden of uncertainty and doubt and fear and anxiety of how we will get through. For you see, the blessing in Messiah's coming comes when we cast aside those anxieties and simply reach out to meet the needs around us, recognizing Yahweh's care for one and all without distinction. This is the Messianic blessing so eagerly awaited, so anticipated, even if misunderstood. The breath of Yahweh is upon me to bind up the broken, to lift up the fallen, to release the captives, the political prisoners, and those in debtor's prison, to release people from conflict and anguish over resources, to cancel debts and restore everyone to full participation in the world as Yahweh created it to be. Is this what we are awaiting? Is it our desire to accept the Messianic blessing according to Yahweh's definitions? Or are we still stuck in some competing grasp of what life is all about?